The first sound is not steel, but silk, a cord, stretched taut in the shadows, whispering across skin. In the Ottoman palace, death could arrive in complete silence. No drums, no shouts, only the faint tightening of a bowstring. By dusk, Topkapi's marble courts glow with the day's trapped heat. The carved lattice windows leak gossip into the gardens. The empire breathes in measured ritual. Here, slaves, eunuchs, concubines, and pages are not ornaments of luxury, but the essential gears of a machine so disciplined that even a royal murder could be an administrative routine. In the mid-15th century, Sultan Mehmed II gave this order its legal spine. His canon name, the Imperial Law Code, spelled it without ornament. A new sultan may kill his brothers for the order of the world. No euphemism, no hidden clause, fratricide as a pillar of governance. Execution by silken cord or bowstring was not mercy, merely efficiency. It left no blood on palace floors, which suited a court that preferred its horrors neat. Chroniclers described the rituals in calm prose. Jurists nodded in agreement. Beyond the gilded doors, the rest of the state's quiet machinery laboured. Boys seized from Balkan villages for the Devshirme levy were marched to the palace, reshaped into soldiers or servants. Eunuchs, purchased far beyond Ottoman borders, became the keepers of the women's quarters and the gatekeepers to power. Janissaries kept the streets in order until their pay was late, when they overturned the market stalls they once protected. Plague clerks tallied the dead with a precision better suited to counting coins. This was not chaos. It was an order so refined it could absorb murder, famine, and revolt into its paperwork. Superstition mingled with statute, cruelty hid behind ceremony, and absurdity often wore the most respectable face in the room. In this film, we'll follow the cord through the palace's quiet corners, the laws, the levies, the rituals, and the rumours that made the Ottoman state as strange as it was formidable. And if you're drawn to the hidden mechanics of empires, the places where power is exercised without ever raising its voice, remember to like this video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. The more witnesses, the better the record. The accession of an Ottoman sultan began with two ceremonies, one public, one private. The public was the sword girding, a dazzling spectacle in which the new ruler received the sword of Osman before a watching crowd. The private one took place in the still air of the palace, in rooms closed to anyone without the right insignia on his belt. This second ritual might involve nothing more elaborate than the quiet arrival of the bostanka, the palace guards, carrying lengths of silk. The principle behind it was written plainly in Mehmed II's 15th century law code, the Kanun. It stated that the new sultan may kill his brothers for the order of the world, Nizam-i-Alem. In the Ottoman conception of statecraft, a realm without rival claimants was a realm without civil war, and a realm without civil war was worth the price of fraternal blood. The phrasing was almost bureaucratic, no emotion, only rationale. To outside observers, this policy seemed like barbarism dressed in calligraphy. But within the empire, it was often presented as the sober choice of a ruler who thought in centuries, not in single reigns. Ottoman chroniclers rarely dwelled on screams or struggles. They preferred to record how swiftly the order was carried out, how calm the succession appeared, how the empire's machinery kept turning. Some sultans exercised this right sparingly, or not at all. Others used it with a kind of cold thoroughness. Murad III had 5 brothers. All 5 died at his accession. His son, Mehmed III, outdid him. In 1595, upon taking the throne, he ordered the strangulation of 19 brothers and half-brothers. They had committed no rebellion, plotted no coup, and were given no trial. Their only crime was being the sons of the same father. The task fell to the bostanka, mute guards trained to kill without noise. They favoured the bowstring or the silken cord methods that spilled no blood, in keeping with palace etiquette. The guards worked in pairs, pulling in unison, ensuring the cord cut the air but not the skin. The execution left a body that could be laid out without scandalous marks, the face still largely intact for burial rites. The location varied, sometimes a secluded room in the palace, sometimes the prince's own quarters, sometimes the cafes, the gilded cage where royal brothers were kept under watch. No public audience ever saw these deaths. The first announcement most subjects heard was not of a massacre, but of a coronation. The rationale was reinforced by history. The Ottomans knew well the costs of succession wars. Before Mehmed II, rival brothers had mobilized armies against each other, dragging provinces into years of instability. The law was a preemptive strike against such outcomes. A single bloody night, it was argued, could save tens of thousands of lives in future campaigns. This logic had its own grim elegance. A dynasty that claimed divine favor also acknowledged human ambition and neutralized it. The cord was not vengeance, it was maintenance. The chroniclers, often themselves dependent on palace patronage, did not challenge the law's morality. They merely noted when it was used and when it wasn't. Yet the very need for such a rule hinted at the fragility of Ottoman unity. If the system required the killing of children to protect the state, what did that say about the state's foundations? The palace did not invite this question. It preferred to treat fratricide as an unfortunate but dignified necessity, like pruning a tree to keep it from splitting under its own branches. There were exceptions and variations. Some princes were spared but confined for life in the cafes, their movements restricted, their days a blend of luxury and claustrophobia. Over time, this practice became more common than outright execution, partly because the political cost of mass fratricide grew harder to ignore, and partly because the dynasty's numbers thinned. Still, the law itself was never repealed in Mehmed II's form, it simply went unused. Foreign envoys sometimes learned of these executions through rumors, whispered by servants or inferred from sudden absences at court. The details they reported to their own rulers were a mix of truth, embellishment, and guesswork. The image of a ruler strangling his own brothers on the night of his coronation became a staple of European writing about the Ottomans, fitting neatly into the West's appetite for tales of Eastern despotism. Inside the empire, the memory of such nights persisted quietly. Court musicians still played, food was still served, the treasury still opened for ceremonial gifts to soldiers. The killing of princes did not pause the rhythms of state, it was folded into them. It was the price of the order of the world, and in the Ottoman palace, the world was ordered first, and explained later, if at all. In the end, the law of brothers was less about cruelty than control, less about personal malice than the state's unblinking calculation. The cord was simply a tool. The decision to pull it was written into the very definition of kingship, a reminder that the throne was a seat surrounded not by brothers, but by potential enemies, some of them still in the nursery. The Ottoman palace was not merely a residence, it was an organism that fed on human arrivals. Some came through conquest, some through diplomacy, and many through a system the Ottomans called devshirme, the gathering. To the empire, it was a levy of talent. To the families who lost their sons, it was a levy of blood. The practice drew most heavily from the Balkans, from Christian communities under Ottoman rule. Boys were taken as young as 8, though adolescent youths were preferred for their strength and adaptability. Imperial agents arrived in villages with registers, lists, and orders from the capital. Local officials assisted in the selection, sometimes with the precision of livestock inspection, height, teeth, physical bearing all noted. Once chosen, the boys were marched away, often hundreds of kilometers, toward a future they did not choose. Along the road, they were placed under the care of palace functionaries or Janissary escorts. The journey was itself a training in obedience. No turning back, no contact with home, no certainty of destination. Upon arrival in Ottoman hands, the transformation began. The boys were converted to Islam, circumcised, and taught the Turkish language. They learned not only military drill but also etiquette, religious recitation, and the bureaucratic rhythms of the empire. The idea was to strip away all previous loyalties and replace them with a singular allegiance to the Sultan, to the state, and to the palace itself. The most promising recruits were sent to the palace schools. There they served first as pages, learning courtly service in the shadow of the throne. Others were trained for the Janissary Corps, the elite infantry that guarded both the palace and the frontiers. The less exceptional found roles in administration, crafts, or logistics, still part of the imperial organism, but not its shining face. Ottoman registers preserve the mechanics of the system with unnerving neatness. Names, ages, places of origin, skills observed. In these ledgers, the boys exist only as entries, without sentiment, as if they were shipments rather than children. For the state, they were raw material to be processed. Foreign travelers and later chroniclers sometimes claimed that certain palace pages were subject to sexual exploitation by senior officials. These allegations appear in memoirs, letters, and hostile histories, though they rarely surface in the Ottoman archives themselves. The silence may indicate suppression, disbelief, or simply the bureaucratic habit of recording only what the system wished to acknowledge. The Devshirme levy was not purely a matter of coercion. In some regions, families quietly sought to have their sons taken, believing palace service could lead to wealth, influence, and safety, privileges unavailable at home. But such cases were exceptions to the prevailing resentment. In the popular memory of many communities, the levy remained an episode of dread, a season when mothers kept their children hidden indoors. For the boys inside the palace, advancement could be dazzlingly fast. A page might rise to become a vizier, a provincial governor, even a grand admiral. The system rewarded loyalty and skill, but it also required absolute obedience. The same cord that silenced royal brothers could also be sent for a wayward official, no matter how high he had climbed. The levy's regularity made it part of the empire's rhythm. Every few years, new columns of boys would enter the system, while the older ones graduated into the military or administrative apparatus. It was a human supply chain, one that allowed the Sultan to staff his court and army without relying on the potentially dangerous nobility of his own bloodline. Over time, reforms and corruption dulled the system's edge. By the 17th century, exemptions grew more common. Bribes could secure selection or avoidance, and the levy's purity as a recruitment mechanism began to erode. Yet in its prime, the Devshirme was a cornerstone of Ottoman governance, an institutionalized migration of childhood into the machinery of state. In the records, the boys taken in one year vanish into their new roles by the next. The ledgers do not follow them into adulthood, do not note who survived a campaign, or who was executed for disloyalty. For the empire's purposes, they had been transformed. Their pasts no longer mattered, only their function did. In this way, the Ottoman household state renewed itself, not by succession of families, but by succession of service. The Devshirme was not a footnote to Ottoman power. It was one of its main arteries, pulsing with the lives of children who entered as strangers and emerged as instruments of the throne. In the Ottoman palace, the innermost gates were not guarded by soldiers in shining armor, but by men who could never have sons. Eunuchs, both black and white, stood as human locks on the empire's most private doors. Their presence was at once practical and symbolic, a barrier of flesh and discipline between the Sultan's family and the outside world. The black eunuchs, commanded by the Kızlar Asi, controlled the women's quarters, the harem-i-humayun. They held the keys, literally and politically, to the imperial harem. No message, no gift, and no visitor reached the Sultan's women without passing through their hands. White eunuchs, meanwhile, guarded other inner gates, palace schools, treasury rooms, and corridors that led to the ruler's chambers. The Ottomans did not perform the castration themselves. Islamic law, as interpreted by the empire's jurists, discouraged or forbade the act within its domains. Instead, the cutting was done far away, in Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt, often by non-Muslim intermediaries. Boys were taken from their families, altered in body and future, and sold into the Ottoman sphere through Red Sea and Mediterranean markets. Mortality was staggering. Contemporary accounts suggest that more than half of those castrated died from the procedure or its aftermath. Those who survived were considered exceptionally valuable commodities, A living eunuch was the result of both chance and endurance, and the palace paid accordingly. Their duties went far beyond standing guard. The Kızlar managed vast sums of money, oversaw the maintenance of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and carried confidential orders from the Sultan. In some reigns, this official was one of the 2 or 3 most powerful figures in the empire, able to influence appointments, exiles, and even policy decisions. Within the harem, the black eunuchs acted as both gatekeepers and couriers. They transmitted messages between the sultan and his concubines, between the Valid Sultan, Queen Mother, and her political allies, and between rival factions of the palace women. The eunuchs' control over communication gave them a subtle but enduring power to delay a letter, to misplace an order, or to present information with a particular inflection could alter the course of palace politics. Some European observers, often hostile to the empire, reported rumors of sexual exploitation of young male pages by eunuchs or high-ranking officials. These claims appear in travelers' diaries, diplomatic correspondence, and polemical histories. The Ottoman archives remain silent on such matters, perhaps by policy, perhaps by genuine omission. Silence in these rooms was more than habit, it was part of the architecture. The paradox of the eunuch's life was sharp. They lived in the heart of the palace, yet owned no family name to pass on, no heirs to inherit their influence. Their power was personal and temporary, tied to the favor of the sultan or the queen mother. When that favor ended, exile or a quiet disappearance often followed. Despite their precarious position, some eunuchs accumulated fortunes. They invested in waqfs, charitable endowments that outlived them, funding mosques, fountains, and schools. These public works bore their names, the only way they could leave a legacy. A eunuch might have no descendants, but a fountain flowing in his name could endure for centuries. The black eunuch's prominence was unique to the Ottoman court. In many other Islamic states, white eunuchs predominated in the harem. The Ottomans reversed this, making African eunuchs central to the harem's operation. This choice was not only logistical but symbolic. The ultimate insiders were, by origin, complete outsiders to the Anatolian and Balkan heartlands. Their authority could provoke resentment among other palace officials, especially those born into Ottoman Muslim families. Yet to the Sultan, their foreignness and lack of heirs made them safe. They could wield enormous influence without ever posing a dynastic threat. The very condition that defined them physically also defined their political utility. By the 17th century, the Kızlar was a fixture in every major political drama of the court. From arranging royal marriages to brokering alliances between viziers, his influence radiated outward from the harem's locked gates. Behind him stood a corps of men whose voices might never rise above a whisper, yet whose footsteps shaped the course of the empire. In the Ottoman palace, the eunuch's body was a credential, his silence a weapon, and his absence of heirs the ultimate guarantee of loyalty. The gates they guarded were physical and symbolic alike, separating not only spaces but worlds in which the empire's most decisive politics unfolded behind screens, curtains, and a wall of men who could never leave a trace of themselves in the cradle. Under the high domes of Topkapı, the sound of water trickling through marble basins was constant. Courtyards breathed in the scent of roses and damp stone, yet behind the latticework of the imperial harem, the stillness held another purpose. Here, in the empire's inner world, the future of the dynasty was calculated not in councils or battlefields, but in cradles. Each child was a potential storm. The Ottoman court had refined the art of succession into a system where political marriage was a liability. Unlike many European monarchs, the Sultan rarely took a queen from a rival house. Instead, his heirs came from enslaved concubines, women without family connections that could threaten the throne. It was a logic as cold as the marble beneath their feet. No in-laws meant no rival factions. These concubines, often taken from the slave markets of Constantinople, Cairo, or captured in war, were trained for more than beauty. They learned court etiquette, the hierarchies of the harem, the rules of deference. Some were of noble birth before captivity. Others came from modest rural lives. In the palace, those pasts dissolved into the uniform discipline of service. A principle guided the harem: one mother, one son. It was both a form of balance and control. By limiting each woman to a single male heir, the sultan avoided the rise of maternal dynasties, clusters of brothers who might unite against him. The women could rise in status if their son became a favorite, but never produce an alliance of brothers to challenge the throne. When a sultan died, his concubines faced an abrupt change in fortune. Many were sent to the old palace, a quieter, more confined residence, effectively retiring from court life. For some, this meant a life of comfort. For others, of loneliness. The removal was a matter of routine, as predictable as the tolling of a mosque bell at prayer time. Chroniclers, especially foreign ones, tell darker tales. In certain moments of panic or uncertain succession, entire harems were said to be executed to remove any possibility of future claimants. Strangulation, the preferred method for preserving royal dignity, required no public spectacle. Whether these events were common or exceptional remains debated, for palace archives are notably silent on the matter. Ottoman records, when they do speak, often present these transitions in the bland vocabulary of bureaucracy. Transfers, stipends, property lists. The human lives behind them are reduced to entries in ink, their ambitions and fears lost in the folds of ledgers. Yet to read these lists is to see the machinery of succession working as intended, clean on paper, messy in practice. The mothers of princes could be powerful figures while their sons lived. Some became Valid Sultan, the Queen Mother, wielding influence in appointments, diplomacy, and palace intrigue. But their authority was tied to their child's survival. A prince's death, whether from illness or order, turned a power broker into a figure of nostalgia almost overnight. Behind the lattice screens, competition was quiet but constant. Alliances were built not in public courts but through the placement of a servant, the whisper of a rumour, the gift of a rare spice or fabric. The harem's calm was an aesthetic achievement. Beneath it, currents of rivalry ran deep. It was a system that avoided the entanglements of noble marriage, but not the dangers of succession itself. Fratricide, imprisonment, and the cafes, the gilded cage for royal brothers, all existed because concubinage did not solve the central problem. More than one prince meant more than one possible ruler. Still, the method endured. It kept foreign dynasties out of Ottoman politics, ensured heirs were raised entirely within the imperial household, and maintained the sultan's supremacy over every branch of his own family. What it could not control was chance, a sickly heir, a sudden death, the unpredictable reach of palace intrigue. In this way, the harem was both nursery and battlefield. The weapons were not swords but appointments, affections, and timing. And while the empire's armies might win or lose on distant frontiers, the question of who would next wear the crown was often decided in the stillness of those inner chambers, where the trickle of fountains masked the most consequential silences in the Ottoman world. In the alleys of 17th century Istanbul, the smell of roasting beans drifted out from narrow doorways, curling into the morning air like an invitation and a warning. Inside, men leaned over steaming cups, speaking in voices pitched just below the clatter of cups on brass saucers. The drink was dark, bitter, and habit-forming, not merely for its taste, but for the conversations it carried. Coffeehouses were a recent arrival, but they spread with the urgency of gossip. By the mid-1500s, they had become fixtures in neighbourhoods from Galata to Üsküdar. The attraction was obvious: cheap seating, a hot drink, and an audience. News passed more quickly there than through any official channel, and the news was rarely just news. In the right company, it could turn into politics. The Ottoman court understood the danger immediately. Coffeehouses gathered not only merchants and artisans, but also soldiers on leave, poets with grievances, clerks with information, and preachers with an audience. Conversation, once it left the cup, could not be taxed, controlled, or revoked. Chroniclers like Persevi note repeated bans on coffee in the spaces where it was served. The bans were rarely permanent. Closure, followed by reopening, became its own rhythm, as predictable as the seasons. In each cycle, the court demonstrated that it could act, and that it was watching. Murad IV's reign gave these measures their most enduring legends. Later storytellers claimed he patrolled the streets in disguise, executing those caught drinking in defiance of his orders. The official record is cooler: orders for closures, raids on specific establishments, and punishments for proprietors. The image of a sultan personally wielding a sword over a cup of coffee seems to have been brewed more by imagination than archive. Still, the legend persisted, perhaps because it fit the logic of the time. To the authorities, coffee houses were not leisure, they were workshops of dissent. The court feared them less for drunken disorder. Alcohol was already under moral suspicion, and more for sober clarity. A mind sharpened by caffeine could also sharpen an argument. In the neighborhoods, enforcement was uneven. A coffeehouse near the docks might be raided twice in a month, while one tucked behind a mosque wall might go untouched for years. This inconsistency was not a flaw of the system, but part of its message. Permission was conditional, and no one could be certain when it would be withdrawn. The drink itself carried its own symbolism. Imported from Yemen, traded through the Red Sea ports, and taxed along caravan routes, coffee was already a commodity of imperial reach. To control its consumption was, in a way, to demonstrate control over the empire's own arteries. When coffeehouses closed, conversation shifted to private rooms or shop fronts. The talk did not stop, it simply changed venue. Spies and informants followed it, sometimes more diligently than the bans themselves. A ban on coffee could thus increase the perception of conspiracy more than the reality. For those who obeyed, abstention was a quiet loyalty. For those who ignored the ban, each sip was a private defiance. The line between law-abiding subject and subtle dissenter could be no thicker than the rim of a porcelain cup. In the end, coffee survived every prohibition. It became as embedded in Ottoman daily life as the call to prayer, part of the city's rhythm and an unspoken reminder that control, no matter how absolute it claimed to be, was never total. And so the empire learned an old truth dressed in a new aroma. The smallest of gatherings, held over the smallest of cups, could still carry the largest of ideas. Ideas that no cord, decree, or disguise could fully contain. The sound of discontent in Istanbul was rarely a roar at first. It began with a low murmur in the barracks, the scrape of bowls with no bread, the quiet counting of coins that felt lighter than the month before. Among the Janissaries, patience was not an inherited virtue. When pay was late or silver debased, the city would soon know. The Janissaries were not only soldiers, they were an economic force. They fixed bread prices, demanded subsidies, and treated the provisioning of the capital as a matter of military honor. In practice, this meant that a baker's miscalculation could be as dangerous as a battlefield defeat. The empire fed them well when it could, and when it could not, it fed on the anxiety of what might follow. Their payroll, the ulufe, was meant to arrive quarterly, in solid silver coin. A missing shipment, or coins shaved and thinned to stretch the treasury, was taken as an insult. Debasement was not an abstract concept here. It was the feel of a lighter purse, the glint of a duller coin. When grievances ripened, the Janissaries did not write petitions. They marched. Barracks emptied into the streets, and the line between soldier and mob dissolved. Sometimes their target was the palace, sometimes a minister, sometimes the hapless officials tasked with provisioning the city. The Chinar incident of 1656 was the most infamous of these purges. A plane tree in the hippodrome was used to hang the bodies of executed officials, their deaths ordered under the pressure of Janissary anger. Chroniclers likened the site to the mythical wak-wak tree, whose branches bore human heads as fruit, an image equal parts grotesque and symbolic. The message was always the same. The Janissaries could make or unmake governments without firing a shot at a foreign enemy. The power of the sword was matched by the power of the crowd it could summon. Ministers who underestimated this rarely lasted long. Even in calmer years, the threat lingered. The court understood that military discipline on campaign could dissolve into urban insurrection at home. This double life, loyal army abroad, volatile guild at home, was not a flaw but a defining feature of the core. Bread and coin were the twin measures of their satisfaction. When both were secure, the Janissaries could be counted on to keep the city's peace. When either failed, they became its most dangerous element. Market prices and currency quality were therefore matters of state security, monitored as closely as any border. Foreign observers were often surprised to find the empire's most elite soldiers haggling in markets or inspecting loaves for weight. To the Janissaries, this was no contradiction. Feeding the capital was part of defending it, and justice in the bakery was as serious as justice on the battlefield. Ottoman chroniclers tended to record the resolutions rather than the chaos, the appointments of new ministers, the public proclamations of restored order. But in the spaces between those entries, one can read the unease, the knowledge that calm was a condition granted, not guaranteed. The Janissary riots were not senseless explosions of temper. They were calibrated demonstrations of leverage. A delay in pay could be turned into a reshuffling of the empire's highest offices, a shortfall in bread into a lesson in political fragility. And so, in the Ottoman capital, the stability of government could depend as much on the weight of a loaf and the ring of a coin as on the loyalty of an army, especially when the army was also the crowd. The air on the frontier rarely stood still. It moved with the rhythm of hooves, the creak of wagons, and the dull thud of drums that carried farther than voices. On the horizon, banners rose and fell like a tide, each one announcing not only an army's presence but its intent to be seen. In this landscape, the Ottoman and Habsburg borderlands became a theatre in which survival and intimidation were the twin performances of every campaign. On both sides, spectacle was considered strategy. A fortress could be taken with gunpowder, but its spirit was broken with display. Ottoman chronicles describe standards planted in conquered ground, the crescent emblem catching the light just long enough for those inside the walls to see. Habsburg accounts mirror the gesture, their own flags raised above breached palisades, the image of the double-headed eagle meant to loom over the memory of those who saw it. Villages in these contested zones became unwilling stages. Some were emptied, their inhabitants herded along the roads as visible proof of a commander's reach. Others were left smouldering, the ash meant to send a message far beyond its smell. Whether ordered by decree or carried out by restless soldiers, the results were the same: absence, silence, and a faint haze that marked the edge of someone else's control. The siege was the purest expression of this ritualized fear. In 1683, during the Great Ottoman Campaign against Vienna, reports tell of heads displayed on stakes along the encampment's perimeter. The number changes with the chronicler, 20 in one telling, hundreds in another. But the visual is constant. A perimeter not of earthworks alone but of human warnings. Such acts were less about the enemy's suffering than about the audience within one's own ranks, a reminder of what awaited deserters or traitors. The Habsburg forces answered in kind. Captured Ottoman scouts might be hung from gates in full view of advancing troops, the ropes swaying gently in the wind, as if keeping time with the beat of the war drums. In some cases, severed heads were sent between commanders as tokens, part insult, part inventory, an unspoken ledger of retribution. The exchange was not recorded as barbarity in the day's reports, but as customary practice. These gestures extended beyond the battlefield. On campaign routes, dismembered banners, dented helmets, or even the stripped harness of a defeated enemy's horse were paraded into market towns. The intention was the same as any military communique: to announce victory, control, and the inevitability of the army's next move. Merchants and farmers received the message without needing to read a word. For commanders, terror was a form of currency. It could be spent in advance of an assault to weaken resolve, or hoarded until the right moment to amplify the effect of a sudden strike. A garrison might surrender not because its walls had fallen, but because its will had already been dismantled by weeks of carefully staged cruelty. In this economy, spectacle was cheaper than a prolonged siege, and often more reliable. Foreign envoys sometimes wrote of these practices with a kind of detached admiration. To them, the arrangement of trophies on the field or at a city gate was a sign of discipline, not savagery. One Venetian observer remarked that the Ottomans display death with the same symmetry they display their tents, a comparison that revealed as much about the observer as the observed. In the frontier world, aesthetics and annihilation often shared the same frame. The rituals were also internal theatre. When an Ottoman bey returned from a raid, he might present captives before the provincial governor as proof of service. The captives themselves, often bound in deliberate patterns, became living documentation, a form of paperwork without ink. This was not improvisation, but adherence to a political script in which loyalty was demonstrated through tangible spoils. Even the weather could become part of the message. Snow along the Danube would preserve the marks of slaughter long after the armies had moved on, its surface pitted with frozen impressions of hooves and the angular shapes of abandoned equipment. In summer, dust storms carried the scent of burned grain into territories that had not yet been reached, a prelude carried on the wind. Nature became the courier for human intent. And yet, for all the brutality, there was method. The Ottomans and Habsburgs alike maintained manuals, orders, and rituals that dictated how such displays should be arranged. Which trophies were taken, where they were placed, and who was allowed to see them, all were matters of formal record. Terror, in this sense, was not the chaos of battle, but the order imposed after it. The frontier world was never static. Walls were built, raised, and built again. Rivers changed course, taking borders with them. But the logic of intimidation persisted, as constant as the tolling of bells in garrison towns or the call to prayer in an occupied village. In both empires' minds, the image was as decisive as the cannon. It is in this climate of calculated spectacle that the next scenes of our story unfold, where plague registers and palace intrigues would prove that even in death, there was a system. The arrival of plague in an Ottoman city did not announce itself with alarm bells. It came quietly, a house shuttered, a market stall left unattended, a funeral without the usual procession. Only when the deaths accumulated did the state make itself visible, and when it did, it was not as a healer, but as an accountant. In the registers, disease was less an event than a column of figures to be balanced. In 1513, plague officials in Istanbul began keeping daily tallies. Their ledgers recorded not the cries of the sick, but the precise number of burials per quarter. A neat hand marked each line, the ink still visible today, the handwriting steady even as the toll rose. To read these records is to hear not panic, but the rustle of paper in a clerk's chamber. The empire had long ago learned that death could be managed like a resource. Officials known as tornemini, or plague wardens, enforced quarantines, organized burial crews, and supervised the cleaning of markets. They were not physicians. Their duty was containment, not cure. Their presence meant the disease had entered the realm of administration. Night burials became standard policy. Bodies were moved after dark, lit only by lanterns whose oil was counted as carefully as the corpses they illuminated. This reduced public alarm, or so the theory claimed. Though everyone knew the sight of mule carts at midnight was its own announcement, the city learned to look away from what it could not stop. Quarantine measures varied. In coastal cities, ships suspected of carrying plague were held offshore, their crews confined in floating isolation. Merchants grumbled at the delays, but the same merchants petitioned for these measures when the outbreak was inland. In both cases, commerce bent reluctantly to mortality. Some neighborhoods resisted official intervention. Relatives of the sick sometimes hid them, fearing confiscation of property or the indignity of hasty burial. Such concealment only widened the outbreak, forcing wardens to extend their patrols. Plague, like rumor, traveled best where doors were left half closed. The archive rarely records the smell of these years, but contemporary letters hint at it. One court scribe described the air heavy as a storeroom of damp wool, while another noted the silence of streets where cats have no work. The imagery is domestic, almost gentle, yet behind it stands the knowledge of absence. Plague was not dramatic in its moments, but in its accumulation. Certain mosques and fountains were associated with miraculous protection. People gathered there in numbers that defied quarantine orders, bringing food for the poor as a form of insurance. Authorities tolerated some of this activity, seeing in it a way to keep public morale intact. Prayers, unlike physicians, cost nothing from the treasury. The empire's courts treated plague as a fact, not a mystery. Testimonies from these years mention it in the same breath as disputes over property or inheritance. A witness might confirm the terms of a debt, and then remark, almost as an aside, that the debtor was taken by the pestilence last month. Death altered the names in a contract, but not the contract itself. For the military, plague was both a threat and an opportunity. An outbreak in an enemy city could delay a siege or invite a sudden advance. Campaign chronicles note these moments in passing, like changes in the weather. Disease was a participant in the war, silent but decisive. And still, the record keepers wrote, their ledgers contain no consolations, no lamentations, only dates, districts and numbers. It is this unblinking quality that gives the Ottoman plague archive its peculiar atmosphere, an empire that could measure mortality without changing its handwriting. This same calm, almost indifferent order will reappear in the palace itself, where the fall of a political figure could be as quietly documented as the loss of a neighborhood to disease. From the streets to the harem, the bowstring and the fever belong to the same logic, that all endings were, in the end, matters of record. Night in the palace was rarely silent. Even when the outer courtyards slept, the inner rooms carried the whisper of slippered feet on marble, the faint creak of a door attended by hands too careful to be heard. Light came not from torches, but from small oil lamps set low, their glow designed to guide a servant without revealing him to the wrong pair of eyes. It was in such hours that politics moved most efficiently. In 1651, the figure at the center of this night was Kösem Sultan. Once a concubine, then Queen Mother, she had ruled through sons and grandsons, her influence spanning decades. Her apartments in the women's quarters were more than living space. They were an office of state. Courtiers, eunuchs, and petitioners passed through her lattice-screened reception like messages through the empire's veins. But by that summer, the veins were clogged with intrigue. The young Sultan, Mehmed IV, was only a boy. His mother, Turhan Sultan, saw Kösem's influence as a threat to her own. Factions formed, some loyal to the elder Queen Mother, others to the younger. Rumours, never in short supply in the harem, began to focus not on policy, but on survival. The method of her removal was shaped by the rules of the place. Bowstrings were forbidden in the women's quarters. Weapons, in theory, could not pass the inner gates, so the chroniclers tell us that curtains were used instead, cords drawn from the fabric that hung in her own chambers. It was not improvisation, but adaptation to etiquette. Accounts differ in their details. Some say Kösem was awoken by her attackers and struggled, scattering coins she had kept at hand for bribes or sudden escapes. Others describe a swift, almost ceremonial act, the silence broken only by the soft rip of cloth becoming rope. Both versions agree on the outcome, the elder Queen Mother dead before dawn. The Kızlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch, is named in some sources as a participant, in others as merely present. His authority over the women's quarters meant that nothing could happen without his awareness. Whether he gave the order or simply allowed it, his role is preserved in the careful vagueness of the records. The archive, in such cases, preferred ambiguity to confession. Outside her chambers, the palace continued as if nothing had changed. Pages went about their errands, cooks prepared the morning meal, the call to prayer echoed over the Bosphorus. The machinery of the state was not designed to pause for a single death, even one at the top of the harem hierarchy. The absence was noted, then folded into the day's routine. Turhan Sultan emerged as the undisputed power behind her son. Her position secured, she set about projects to cement her legacy, including the construction of the Yeni Mosque in Istanbul. In official histories, these building works often overshadow the way she came to power. Stone is a more durable record than whispered accusation. For those within the palace, the lesson was clear. Influence could be accumulated over decades and removed in minutes. No title, no alliance, no record of service could prevent the moment when the lamps were dimmed and the door slid shut behind an unannounced visitor. The bowstring, even when disguised as curtain cord, was still the final signature of imperial will. Foreign observers learned of Kösem's death through fragments: a merchant's letter, a diplomat's report, a rumor repeated in the marketplace. The image of a ruler's mother strangled in her own rooms became part of the Ottoman legend abroad, feeding the European appetite for stories of palace intrigue. Whether these tales exaggerated or softened the truth, they all carried the same moral: proximity to the throne was a dangerous privilege. And so, within those thick palace walls, politics and death remained neighbours. One could hear the muffled laughter of a court musician on the same night a power broker was quietly removed. The curtain fell, literally and figuratively, leaving the rest of the empire to wake unaware of what had shifted while they slept. From here, the story turns outward again, to the rulers themselves, their human frailty, the accidents that shaped succession, and the absurd ways in which the empire's most powerful bodies could meet their end. Under the winter light of December 1574, the marble of the Topkapı Palace courtyard held a pale, almost translucent gleam. The stone had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, servants, scribes, guards, each leaving nothing but the faint memory of movement. On one such evening, the reigning Sultan, Selim II, walked this same surface. The court annals would later claim he slipped. The detail was not contested, but the causes, as always in imperial histories, were negotiable. Some chroniclers placed the fall near the baths, where steam condensed on stone like a thin veil. Others suggested the palace's great hall, polished for a reception, had become treacherous underfoot. In both versions, the element of chance was paired with the certainty of consequence. Selim's head struck, his body failed, and the empire learned again that even a ruler's person was not immune to the most mundane hazard. Selim had been known in his lifetime as Sarı Selim, Selim the Blonde, but the more enduring epithet would be the Sot. The sobriquet appeared most insistently in later histories, attaching itself to tales of his fondness for wine, particularly from the island of Cyprus, which his navy had taken in 1571. It was tempting for storytellers to draw a straight line, from conquest to vineyard to intoxication to a fatal slip. The official record, however, was silent on whether drink was involved on the day in question. Ottoman chroniclers rarely indulged in medical detail. The imperial register might note the date of death, the burial at Hagia Sophia, and the accession of Murad III, but not the bruise, the swelling, or the breathless minutes between injury and silence. The body of the Sultan passed into history with the same bureaucratic neatness as a tax decree. In this way, his fall was less an anomaly than a reminder that succession did not pause for explanation. Selim's reign had been short by Ottoman standards, 8 years, and his death required immediate compliance with protocol. The same bowstring law that could silence a prince did not touch a sultan. Instead, the machinery of state moved to install the next without interruption. The council met, proclamations were drafted, and the Janissary Corps was notified. The palace marble was scrubbed clean. In the weeks after, foreign envoys dispatched reports to their home courts. Venetian and Habsburg letters alike repeated the slippery marble story, each tinged with polite incredulity. A sovereign might be felled by battle, plague, or intrigue. To be undone by architecture seemed almost indecorous, yet the accounts persisted, their very repetition giving them a kind of official dignity. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. In an empire where executions could be wrapped in silken cord and rebellions smothered in the cradle, the ruler himself had no defense against condensation and gravity. No guard could intercept a wet stone. No decree could command friction. Selim's death entered the genre of court anecdote, a category where verifiable fact and conversational embellishment were equal citizens. In later retellings, the marble grew slicker, the fall more dramatic, the wine cup in his hand more ornate. The palace, in these versions, was less a seat of power than a stage for fatal comedy. The architectural setting was real enough. Ottoman palaces prized polished surfaces, stone courtyards, glazed tiles, marble fountains. These reflected light beautifully in ceremony and betrayed the unwary when damp. Their beauty was meant to impress visiting dignitaries, but it also concealed hazards for those who walked them daily. Selim II's passing prompted no official mourning in the sense of political hesitation. The empire moved forward as it always did, unblinking, procedural, already bending its energy toward the next campaign season. His personal tastes, his alleged vices, and his unceremonious end became footnotes in larger narratives of conquest and administration. Still, the marble remained. Servants continued to carry trays across it. Guards marched their patrols. It endured longer than the reign of the man who had slipped upon it. In this way, the stone was the perfect witness for Ottoman history. Hard, reflective, and utterly unmoved by those who ruled above it. And so the story of Selim's fall, whether simple misstep or cautionary fable, survived in the intersection between archival brevity and human appetite for narrative. A ruler's body could be mortal. The machinery he commanded remained as polished and as indifferent as the marble that met him at the end. The Bosphorus in the summer of 1648 was a calm expanse of shifting blue, the sort of stillness that could hide both commerce and catastrophe beneath its surface. From the sea walls of Topkapı Palace, one could look down to where the water lapped against the stone and imagine nothing more than the slow, measured rhythm of tides. Yet later chroniclers would claim that here, in these same waters, hundreds of women from the imperial harem were once sewn into sacks and dropped without ceremony. The tale belongs to Ibrahim I, the Sultan whose reign began with high expectations and ended in deposition and death. His sobriquet in some histories, the Mad, was not an official title, but it clung to his memory with the same persistence as the story of the drowned concubines. The version most often told begins with panic, rumours of disloyalty or plots within the harem, and the Sultan's sudden order for wholesale elimination. Contemporary records, however, are noticeably thin. Court registers, the same that carefully logged grain shipments and Janissary stipends, do not contain entries for such a mass execution. The few Ottoman chroniclers of the time mention unrest and the Sultan's instability, but not the drowning itself. The details arrive in later, often hostile accounts, European diplomatic dispatches, popular histories, and moralizing chronicles written decades after his fall. What is known is that Ibrahim's court life was marked by extremes of indulgence. He took concubines in extraordinary numbers, breaking with the one mother, one son convention. Gifts of sable furs, pearls, and silks flowed into the harem. The Kızlar Ağası, chief black eunuch, gained unprecedented influence under his patronage. The line between private pleasure and public governance blurred, and foreign envoys began to report a ruler more interested in amusements than affairs of state. These same envoys were quick to collect scandal. In their letters, the Bosphorus drowning became a spectacle of imperial caprice. A sultan, seized by suspicion, ordering the execution of women en masse. The image was vivid. The sacks, the hurried stitches, the weighted plunge into the dark water. It was the sort of tableau that did not require verification to survive in popular memory. The panic that might have fueled such an order was not unimaginable. The harem, despite its layers of protocol and surveillance, was a political arena. Concubines could act as conduits for factional influence. Mothers of princes were especially sensitive figures in the succession game. Removing them in a single decisive gesture would have been an act both of consolidation and of fear. whether real or perceived. Ibrahim's temperament, as described by those who served and observed him, lent itself to abrupt reversals. Rewards could be lavish, punishments sudden. In this, he was not unique among sultans, but his unpredictability made such stories believable, even without firm evidence. Once a ruler was branded with instability, every rumor seemed plausible. If the drownings did not occur as told, they nonetheless served a narrative purpose. They compressed Ibrahim's reign, its excess, its volatility, its abrupt end, into a single, arresting image. That image traveled more easily than the nuanced politics of the era. It confirmed, for many outside the empire, their preferred picture of an oriental despotism unmoored from reason. By the summer of 1648, Ibrahim's own position had become untenable. A coalition of palace officials and Janissaries deposed him, placing his young son Mehmed IV on the throne. Within 10 days, Ibrahim was strangled in the palace, the Silken Cord succeeding where rumour had already done much of the work. The Bosphorus, if it had been a witness, did not speak. Its currents carried trade ships and fishing boats as they always had. The story of the drowned harem floated instead through the channels of memory, embassies, and printing presses, swelling in detail with each retelling. Even now, historians tread carefully. Between the silence of the Ottoman archives and the noise of later narratives lies a gulf as wide as the strait itself. The water remains, moving as it did in 1648, deep enough to hide what it must, restless enough to carry whatever stories the world chooses to cast upon it. The summer of 1826 opened hot in Istanbul, the air thick with the mingled scents of the golden horn, brine, tar, and the smoke of morning cook fires drifting from the shipyards. In the barracks of the Janissaries, the old soldiers still gathered in the courtyards, as they had for centuries, their ranks less disciplined now than ceremonial. Their white felt caps and worn uniforms carried the weight of tradition, but the empire around them had begun to change in ways the corps could not or would not match. For generations, the Janissaries had been the Sultan's household troops, born of the Devshirmi levy, trained in the palace schools, and bound by loyalty to the throne. By the 19th century, the levy had long since faded, replaced by recruits from within the empire, often sons of Janissaries themselves. What had begun as a corps of forcibly converted Christian boys had become a hereditary guild, with political clout, commercial interests, and a reputation for resisting reform. The Sultan of the moment, Mahmud II, had watched them for years. Their refusal to adopt new drill methods, their readiness to riot over pay or provisions, and their interference in court politics. His predecessors had tried appeasement and half measures. Mahmud prepared for something less reversible. The first step came under the guise of modernization. A new military unit, drilled in European fashion, was proposed, the Sekban, a Sedit. Officially, it was to serve alongside the Janissaries. Unofficially, it was meant to replace them. The Janissaries, hearing the plan, read it as an open threat to their standing. They had toppled sultans before. They believed they could do so again. In June, they gathered to protest in the traditional manner, upturning their soup cauldrons, the great Kazan kettles that symbolized their unity. This act, once a warning to negligent commanders, now marked open defiance of the throne. The protest spread from barracks to street, and within hours, Istanbul was bracing for another Janissary revolt. Mahmud II had made his preparations well in advance. Loyal artillery units were stationed near the At-Maidani, the hippodrome, where the Janissaries were assembling. Orders were given not for negotiation, but for bombardment. As the rebels gathered, the cannons opened fire, their reports echoing off the stone facades of the old city. The fighting was brief and decisive. The barracks burned. Survivors were hunted down in the streets. By the next day, the Janissary Corps, once the central instrument of Ottoman military power, was effectively gone. Official chronicles gave the event a name of studied optimism, the Auspicious Incident. Afterward, the Sultan ordered the Corps' abolition in law, as well as in fact. Janissary properties were confiscated, their insignia destroyed, their very name removed from the rolls. Public prayers of thanksgiving were held, and the new, European-style army was expanded to fill the void. The transformation was more than military. The Janissaries had been an informal political force, fixing bread prices, backing viziers, shaping urban unrest. Their absence left a vacuum in Istanbul's street politics. No single group would fill it with the same mixture of armed authority and economic muscle. In the city's coffeehouses, the old stories of Janissary power were still told, of campaigns fought, sultans made and unmade, cauldrons overturned in protest. But now these were historical anecdotes, not warnings. The core that had once threatened rulers had itself been destroyed by one. The Auspicious Incident closed the book on a system born centuries earlier in the quiet march of Levy boys from the Balkans. In its place stood a modernized army, drilled to foreign patterns and loyal, in theory, to the central state. The kettles were cold, the barracks rebuilt, the uniforms gone. Yet, in the collective memory of Istanbul, the Janissary presence lingered like the scent of smoke after a fire. It was a reminder that in the Ottoman world, as in the marble courtyards of the palace, the past could be erased with surprising speed, but never entirely washed away. Twilight settles over the Golden Horn, the city's domes and minarets turning to silhouettes against a sky the colour of old parchment. From the courtyards of Topkapı to the crowded stalls of the bazaar, the Ottoman state appears, at first glance, to be a tapestry of ceremony, law, and faith. But behind every curtain, there was always a cord. Behind every decree, an unspoken clause. Fratricide could be written into law and carried out in silence. Boys taken from distant villages could grow into men who guarded the Sultan's door with absolute loyalty, until the day loyalty required their own removal. Eunuchs without heirs could hold keys that decided the empire's future. The machinery of power was smooth enough that death, exile, or drowning could happen without breaking the rhythm of court music. The absurdity was not in the acts themselves, which were grimly consistent, but in how they coexisted with the trappings of refinement. The same hands that poured coffee in porcelain cups might also carry orders for closure of every coffeehouse in the city. The same marble floors polished for receptions could claim a sultan's life in a single misstep. Power in the Ottoman world was both intimate and remote. It could reach into a child's cradle or a soldier's barracks, yet remain invisible until the moment it acted. Its agents could be velvet-robed jurists, barefoot palace guards, or plague clerks hunched over ledgers, counting the dead as though tabulating grain. It is tempting to imagine these systems as cold, mechanical things, yet they were run by people, fallible, ambitious, fearful, who dressed their decisions in the language of divine order. The phrase Nizam, i-alem, order of the world, sounded as permanent as stone. In practice, it was as fragile as the breath of the ruler who spoke it. The empire endured for centuries not by avoiding violence, but by making it part of the architecture. The bowstring and the banquet could share the same evening. A public prayer could follow a private execution. Even reforms were wrapped in ceremony, their sharper edges hidden until the moment of use. Foreign envoys, returning home with tales of drowned harems, slippery marble, and trees hung with officials, were not merely trading gossip. They were describing a state in which danger was procedural, where beauty and fear were two sides of the same coin. In such a world, the smile was part of the uniform. A vizier could greet a petitioner warmly, even as the order for his removal lay folded in his sleeve. A sultan could bestow silks in the morning and sanction executions by nightfall. The face shown in public was rarely the whole face. Over time, the empire's most lethal tools became less visible, not because they were gone, but because they had been fully integrated into the way things worked. Killing, taking, and counting were no more extraordinary than taxing or trading. The screen between spectacle and reality grew thicker, the smile on its surface more practiced. When the curtain finally fell on Ottoman rule, much of this machinery remained, repurposed under new names. The cords were gone, but the procedures they embodied had left their shape in the mind of the state. The Ottoman smile was not false, it was functional. It held the empire together as much as the army or the treasury did, but like the silken cord it so often concealed, it could tighten without warning, and when it did, the gesture was as smooth and deliberate as it was final.